Okay, MOvember 2019. This is one of the makeup videos I'm doing because I'm away on some retreats over a couple of weekends, and I want to do the cycle of addiction. And within this cycle is a system, and that's what we need to unpack here today. So, with addiction, the most commonly asked question is, am I an addict, or have I just got an abuse issue with this? And largely what they're asking is, can I modify this and harm minimize it, or do I need to have a major intervention in my life? So generally, people who use sexuality, food, drugs, alcohol, busyness, sport, work, all the things we can become addicted to, gambling, we can do pretty functionally. But for some of us, we have an abuse issue with it, and for some of us, we have an addiction issue. So what's the difference? If you're an addict, it should meet a certain criteria, and that criteria will be compulsive use, impaired control, continued use in spite of consequence. You'll see the phenomenon of craving. And what we know about craving now is the neurobiology of addiction has really expanded. The American Medical Association has a definition of addiction that basically brings it down to a chronic disorder of the brain's reward, memory, and motivational circuitry. They've just updated their model. I saw that Dr. Robbie Abels has sort of brought that to a lot of Australians practitioners' attention. They've changed it to the American Medical Association in September this year. But essentially, the essence of it is the same. They're putting some more emphasis on that need for connection as opposed to just trying to treat addiction as an isolated incident. It's more of a holistic lifestyle. So what that means, though, for someone who has a brain disorder, it means that the addiction itself modifies the reward system and the memory system in the brain, and that this modification really impacts motivation, the motivational frontal cortex circuitry that can guide us and modify and push us through and help us to make adult restraintful decisions at times, put the handbrake on. What happens here is, because the reward gets hijacked, and then we have this sort of recall problem around our memory, this euphoric recall, that the motivational circuitry is like the handbrake snaps. So let me talk about what that means around addiction. So most people come into recovery, I suppose the last thing to mention is that the fifth thing would be the denial, that addiction is the only disease that tells you that you don't have it. So we look for the elements of denial, and in Patrick Carnes' work, that it unpacks right at the beginning in his 30-point plan, delusion. We need to, the most essential skill for an addict, he says, is we need to know what is real. And we have been masters of disguise and compartmentalization. So what this does is helps us break down addiction. So people generally come in and they've got that question of, am I an addict, or do I just need to modify this? But let's say they identify and meet that criteria of addiction. And so they go, okay, well, we need to stop. We know now that we need to stop. And largely people get to this point of stopping because they either have a breakdown themselves in the fact that they meet that criteria of addiction, but for things like sex addiction in particular, they've been discovered by somebody. And so somewhere along the line here, there's been some shame and there's been some guilt, and this is largely a despair cycle. And when we hit this, and we're in this part of the disease, largely it will mean that we've got some problems, some unmanageability in our lives that has got us to reach out. And so we're essentially asking for help here under the weight of either financial problems, legal problems, family problems, work can become a problem with work performance, or we get fired due to the addiction. And so we can have all sorts of problems, spiritual problems, religious problems, we're lost ourselves, the light inside's going out. And this help can either be we become aware of the problem, or somehow there is a discovery. Either our boss, our partner, our mother, our father, someone is discovered and feels betrayed. One of the things that Patrick Carnes says is in regards to denial, is the most striking manifestation of addiction is the addict's ability to minimize use and consequence. So it is a real shock sometimes when a third party comes in and they're baffled. They look at this system and they just think, holy smokes, what were you thinking? But for us, we've been able to compartmentalize this thing. It's, hey, what are you talking about? You know. So you've been discovered. There's been some sort of betrayal. The shame and guilt now has exploded. The problems have become catastrophic, and so we're asking for help over here. And largely, the help is needed because most addicts it's not their first rodeo. They've tried to stop on their own, modify the behavior, restrict the behavior, stop it altogether. So most addicts have made promises to self. If you've got a belief system or some values and ethics, or you're a religious person, a Christian, you might have promised God on the Bible 100 times. Can't stop. And the reason we can't stop is because we're not powerless over the behavior. Pia Melody sort of is an addiction specialist and a developmental trauma specialist, and she is the senior fellow of the Meadows in Arizona and wrote book Facing Codependence and many others, Love Addiction and Breaking Free. She makes the point that our reality is made up of our body, our thinking, our feelings, and our behavior. And so just stopping the behavior is a start. But if we don't address the rest of the illness, the rest of our reality, we're not going to make much progress. So what we know about an addiction is that it is fueled by rituals. And we can stop the addiction, but if we don't stop the rituals, if we don't stop hanging around the people that we use with or are associated with using, if we don't stop going to, for a while at least, and sometimes altogether, places that we use, and if we don't get really aware of what are the things, what's the paraphernalia that goes with us. I worked with an alcoholic once, and one of his rituals was he used to keep a whiskey glass in the freezer. It had to be ice cold when he had that drink. There was no way he was going to stop while that whiskey glass remained in the fridge, just in case. This is the addict that keeps their bong. This is the porn addict that keeps access to their pornography stash. You know, this is the person that has got a sexual massage problem that keeps going to get massages and in places they're not really sure if it's good or bad. And of course, they get that offer for more sexuality. We keep hanging around with old pals because we're too afraid to make new connections or go to new places. You know, it's interesting that addicts will come into recovery and they've made incredibly courageous decisions around their addiction, but you can't get them to walk into a 12-step meeting or a therapy group meeting. They're too embarrassed, too ashamed, and yet they'll walk into the worst part of town to buy drugs of someone they've never met, hand over a lot of money to someone they don't know, and place our loyalty in that. In Narcotics Anonymous, they talk about we have, in regards to handing our will and our life over to a power greater than ourselves, they talk about many times we've handed our will and life over to a destructive power. We didn't seem to worry about that. So these rituals are important, and they're important because they trigger this brain disorder. And they're an enormous trigger because the reward, the dopamine part of it, if you're a heroin addict and you're going to get on and buy heroin, if we put you in an MRI or took your statistics, your heart rate would be up, your saliva would be up, your focus, the electricity in your brain, it's game on. Dopamine surging, adrenaline surging, cortisol surging. You are now a chemist. And so this ritual has put us into an addictive state, different than someone else that doesn't meet that criteria of addiction. Now the rituals, for people to participate in these rituals, we have to sort of bring them to mind. So we have a part of an addiction that's preoccupation, and it involves fantasy, objectifying or objectification, and euphoric recall. You could ask an addict to think of their favorite food and where they get that favorite food and what's their favorite way to have that food. And if you got them into a meditative state, really focused on that, you would be able to see the change of state if they're MRI'd their body. What we know here about this preoccupation and ritual zone, it's the hunt zone of the brain. And so when we're in this, we are active. Our euphoric recall triggers the memory triggers reward, and this little circuit that happens now with a broken handbrake means that our body is on fire. And so if we think that we can play in still objectifying and having fantasy and triggering euphoric recall and then hanging out and playing around the edges of these things, if we still think that we can stop here, we're in trouble. Because largely what will happen, the pressure coming down for addicts is they largely just say stuff it, and they charge on in and they act out. And of course it's familiar, they feel bad, and what can even be more shocking to an addict is that they go, well look, I feel bad, but the brain, when it feels bad, knows how to feel good. And so before you know it, the person that's gone to the sex on premises and relapsed on the sex addiction program is now back home watching porn for 2 or 3 hours, because the brain knows and remembers through this euphoric recall how to feel good. So this cycle can go round and round. People get stuck there, and that's why therapists and healthcare professionals really try and implant the idea, if you meet the criteria of addiction, that you've got a robust recovery plan that doesn't get you to relapse. Because if you get into that cycle, we don't know if you're coming out, not even when you're coming out. If you meet the criteria of addiction, what you'll know, you'll have these consequences. And so why would somebody enter this cycle again once they've stopped it? And the way they do that is impaired thinking. And so impaired thinking is on a bit of a continuum. When we first start out with something, it's not a problem. So we do it, it's okay. We really like it, we do it a bit more. We really, really like it, we do it more than we should. And at that point, impaired thinking starts to make excuses for ourselves. And those excuses might be in the beginning pretty benign. Oh, everyone does it. Blokes wolf whistle girls. Everyone has a drink. Most people bet in the Melbourne Cup. We can have our reasons. But once this starts to happen and this starts to get bigger, then the impaired thinking will actually be insane. We can't help it. We can't stop. We're different. It was our fill in the blank. The denial aspect here can be crazy. And that's why the most essential skill really is for an addict to work out what's real. So this impaired thinking, we need to work out in treatment, what is your impaired thinking? What is likely to get you to enter this cycle? Because if we want to get well, we have to learn to arrest addiction here. And I'll talk about that in a second. What we look for in the making of an addict is generally the core beliefs, the I am beliefs, the things about ourselves that we've kept secret. And this is where we explore early childhood trauma, attachment injuries, early exposure issues around culture, environment, peer pressure, things like that, adult traumas. We really need to explore, where do our core beliefs and ethics and values come from? And for a lot of people that have an addiction, they were disconnected early in life, and whatever it was they're overcommitted to now gives them a changed state that numbs out that original injury. So what we look for in early recovery is this pain, because in recovery work we have to get back to addressing this. None of us can outrun our pathology. But for the purpose of this exercise, negative core beliefs: I'm unlovable, I'm unsafe, I'm unworthy, no one will meet my needs and wants, no one will love me as I am, lead on to impaired thinking: everyone does this, there's nothing wrong with having a drink, we'll manage it this time, we'll only do X amount, this time we'll stop, we'll fill in the blank. That leads into actually fantasizing about it, and at this point we go into the rituals. Now we're really salivating. The brain aspect of this disease now is active. The dopamine's flowing, the cortisol's flowing, the serotonin's flowing. We crack on in, we act out, we feel awful, we might get stuck here for a while, and we kick on out, and we just keep accumulating problems. Now, one of the things I'll say in recovery, 12-step work, is this is my warning to anyone in a 12-step program, is that 12-step programs, their third tradition is the only requirement for memberships, the desire to stop. So you can go to your 12-step meeting and you can live on this side of the line. You go to the meeting and you have an experience that week. Let's say you have a work appraisal coming up. The work appraisal triggers the I'm not good enough. Your head says we're never going to get through this unless we get some stress relief. We go into fantasizing, we act out, we go to the meeting and say, oh guys, I'm really sorry I acted out this week, I'm only 2 days sober, I feel really bad, got a lot of shame and guilt, it looks like my DVO thing might get brought back into court because my wife's really unhappy with me, and that's going to cost me a lot of money, I might lose my job as a result of that. And at the end of that, people clap and they say, thanks for coming, thanks for your honesty, I got so much out of it, and that person goes back out to continue acting out. The rest of us go home, might even stay sober. What we've got to get in recovery is that people identify and start to draw their bottom line up here instead of down here. And why the bottom line needs to be moved up here is that this this the place to intervene on an addiction is up in this Bermuda Triangle in here. We need to have no secrets here if we're about to get well. I need to ask for help over here. And how that looks like is we've got an appraisal coming up. Our early childhood trauma gets triggered. We're not good enough. We're not going to make it. Our head kicks in and says, hey, you know what, let's just act out a little bit. We won't go to the brothel. Let's just go have sex on pornography. And immediately we go, oh my God, that's my impaired thinking. That's what I do. We might even go down and get a little bit of fantasy going, and we can feel the danger. And at that point, we reach out for help. And the same guy might be called at the meeting, and it just sounds so different. Pete, would you like to share? Yes, I would. Gosh, I had a hard week. Had an appraisal at work, triggered all my childhood trauma. And for a moment, I had this impaired thinking telling me to act out and it'll be okay. But I knew and I could tell it was an old impaired thought. So I rang my sponsor. My sponsor got me reading more material, got me going to extra meetings. I did some extra journaling. He asked me to up my outreach calls, especially at night when I have unstructured time. That allowed me to then not act out, and I'm really glad that I'm at this meeting tonight, clean and sober, and that I've still got my desire for recovery. And everybody claps, and he sits down, but he goes home to a different world. The road gets thinner, but it gets well lit and well paved. And so if you can, learn to not keep secrets up here. I've got videos on my YouTube page of the provisional beliefs of Patrick Carnes. Early on, our impaired thinking, our core beliefs are really dangerous to us, and we need to subscribe to beliefs that aren't of us until we can manufacture and craft those ourselves. So look for those provisional beliefs in Patrick Carnes' work, and hopefully that will guide you till you can really grab hold and get some momentum yourself. This has been a MOvember 2019 video. Please be gentle with your heart. I'll see you on the recovery road. Hope this is useful, and look out for the next video I'm going to just about to do in a second on the recovery cycle and how we get from doing this to living a whole different way of life. Take care.